Korean movies have always been rock solid, never leaving audiences empty-handed. The absence of strict censorship is certainly an advantage, but being called a masterpiece requires more than just that. Real strength ultimately lies in whether the story itself is compelling enough and captivating enough. The film we're discussing today is one of those low-budget gems that still manages to shine brilliantly. When his wife's head was fished out from the sewage sludge, the man's mind instantly flooded with countless cruel ways to torture the murderer. A surge of anger and hatred welled up inside him. He instantly envisioned hundreds of vengeful scenarios. Yet he could never have imagined during his final moments. The excruciating pain and despair his wife endured far exceeded anyone's imagination. The story begins on a snow-blanketed night. That night, Soo-yeon was driving alone on the suburban road heading home. But halfway through the journey, the car suddenly broke down. The engine sputtered and died, refusing to restart no matter how desperately he tried. Just as he stood there, paralyzed with uncertainty, an old car slowly pulled over to the roadside. The car door opens and a middle-aged man steps out. He looks like an average middle-aged man, wearing a polite smile on his face. He offers assistance to her, outwardly appears as a helpful passerby, but his eyes keep scrutinizing Soo-yeon. He examines her face and the car interior particularly closely. Soo-yeon feels a vague sense of unease. She politely declines his offer of help. The man nods and pretends to leave, but his car stubbornly refused to start. Just as Soo-yeon was about to try starting the car again, the man suddenly rushed at her from behind. Before he could react, a rough hand grabbed him violently. The next instant, a hammer came crashing down on his head. Only when Soo-yeon completely lost consciousness did the man finally stop. This seemingly ordinary middle-aged man was in fact a notorious psychopathic killer. People privately called him Old Gourd. He didn't hesitate for a second, dragged the unconscious Soo-yeon into his car, and took her back to his slaughterhouse, a place that had long become his den of sin. Before long, Soo-yeon woke up in excruciating pain, only to find herself tied to a chair, completely immobile. The room reeked of a nauseating blood stench. In that moment, she finally understood the hell she'd fallen into. With her last ounce of strength, Soo-yeon begged Old Gourd desperately, hoping he'd spare her. Her voice trembled, her eyes brimming with despair. Yet these pleas fell on Old Gourd's. Instead, it seemed to excite him even more. In the eyes of this monster, the fear and despair of the plea seemed like a twisted pleasure. He wasn't saying anything, just slowly picked up a sharp kitchen knife. The next moment, only cold echoes remained in the room. Early the next morning, a little boy was playing by the river when he found a black plastic bag. Curiously, he opened the bag, only for a bloody ear to fall onto the ground. The child screamed in terror on the spot. Upon receiving the report, the police quickly cordoned off the scene and launched a large-scale search operation. Thousands of police officers conducted a thorough search in the vicinity. The media also swarmed in. The reason for such a massive response was the victim's extraordinary identity. Soo-yeon's husband, Soo-hyun, was one of the top agents in the intelligence agency, and his father was the recently retired police commissioner. This case shook the entire nation overnight. Days later, the police finally found Soo-yeon's head in a sewer. When So-hong arrived at the scene and saw what lay before him, his expression froze instantly. This man, always calm and composed, his eyes gradually reddened. He didn't burst into tears, but stood there silently. At that moment, an overwhelming fury was already burning within him. So-hong knew all too well that under South Korea's legal system, even if the killer was caught, they'd merely be sent to prison. What is more, since 1997, South Korea hasn't carried out a single actual execution. This meant the murderer who took his wife's life could very well live comfortably in prison, even potentially grow old there. As this thought crossed his mind, So-hyun's fists clenched tighter. He silently vowed this blood debt wouldn't go unpaid. Soon he requested a 15-day leave from his superiors, ostensibly for rest, but in truth, he'd already resolved to take revenge himself. Before leaving work, he visited the tech department and obtained a special device from a colleague. It was a tracking and eavesdropping capsule that, once swallowed, could pinpoint the target's location at any time. Meanwhile, his father-in-law was leveraging his own connections. Information on 4 suspicious individuals was gathered, all with similar criminal histories, recorded but remained at large due to insufficient evidence or other reasons. Xian was well aware that among these people, the real murderer must be present, and thus the revenge began. And at this very moment, Old Park had already set his sights on a new prey. As usual, he scouted for targets and soon locked onto a young man, a young girl. Old Park put on a kind facade. With just a few words, he tricked the girl into letting her guard down. Under his sweet talk, the girl got into the car without any suspicion. The car drove further into the remote area. The surroundings gradually became desolate and uninhabited. Just as the girl sensed something was wrong, Old Park suddenly pulled out a pre-prepared steel pipe. Everything played out again. Soon after, the girl was also taken back to that slaughterhouse. The guillotine in the house was pulled open once more. Meanwhile, So-hong had already begun investigating the suspects. One by one, he first infiltrated the residence of one of them. The room was dimly lit. The man was sitting in front of the computer, browsing explicit content. Song-hoon approached silently, then subdued the target in an instant. The man was tied up and thrown onto a chair. What followed was a merciless interrogation. After intense questioning, So-hong confirmed this man wasn't the killer of Soo-yeon. But even so, nor did he intend to let this person off easily, because this guy is equally guilty of heinous crimes. So Soo-yeon made him pay in an extremely brutal way. Over the next 3 days, Soo-yeon pursued the clues almost non-stop, day and night. Like a wolf locked onto its prey, he closed in step by step on the real killer. Finally, he tracked down Lao Piao's hometown. But when he knocked on the door, what greeted him was a barrage of harsh curses. Old Piao's father clearly harbored extreme disgust toward his son, even openly stating that Old Piao hadn't been back for ages. But through Old Piao's son, Xu Xian managed to learn about another residence. That was likely Old Piao's true hideout. Xu Xian immediately rushed to that location. It was a dilapidated house, looking eerie and sinister. The door wasn't locked. He quietly slipped inside. The house was eerily quiet. He looked around carefully. Soon he discovered all the drawers were locked. His intuition told him there must be some secret hidden inside. So he fetched a crowbar and pried open the drawers, one by one. But when the drawer opened, the sight before him sent a shock through his heart. They were all filled with women's belongings. Just as Xu Xian was examining these items, suddenly, there came a faint sound from the door behind him. As the door slowly creaked open, a pungent smell of blood assaulted his senses. The floor of the room was covered in dark red bloodstains. Xu Xian stepped into the room cautiously, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Suddenly, he froze near the sink. There, a ring was caught on the edge of the drain. It was the wedding band he'd personally slipped onto his wife's finger. At this sight, Xu Xian stood thunderstruck as if struck by lightning. His wife's once gentle smile kept flashing through his mind, and the scene of his tragic death seemed to slowly piece together before his eyes. At that moment, grief and rage intertwined. Xu Xian knew there was no turning back in his quest for revenge. Meanwhile, Old Park continued, living his life of crime as usual. On the surface, he was just an ordinary school bus driver, ferrying students every day, appearing completely normal. But when night fell, his true nature would emerge. That day, he set his sights on another female student. Exploiting his position as a driver, he effortlessly lured the girl into his car. Before long, the girl was bound hand and foot and taken back to his house. The house was dim and chilly. Old Park stared at the terrified girl as if admiring his prey. A creepy smile spread across his face. Just as he was about to lay hands on the girl, Old Park immediately became alert. He grabbed a sickle nearby and cautiously moved toward the door. The door was suddenly flung open. A man stood outside. That is Su Hun, right there. When Old Park saw it was just one person, a contemptuous smile spread across his face instead. His hands were already stained with blood. Killing one more meant nothing to him. So, he swung his sickle and charged like a rabid beast. But he soon realized he'd underestimated his opponent. Su Hun's movements were astonishingly fast, dodged the attacks with just a few evasive moves. Then he threw a backhand punch right into Old Park's face. After just a few rounds of confrontation, Old Park was clearly at a disadvantage. Seeing he was no match, Old Park turned to flee. So-hyun had anticipated this and quickly gave chase. With a light tap to Old Park's abdomen, before he could react, So-hyun grabbed a plastic sheet from the side and violently pulled it over his head. Cut off from air, Old Park struggled desperately. The terror of suffocation rapidly spread. But Su-hyun seemed to think this wasn't enough to vent his hatred. He grabbed Lao Piao's head and slammed it violently against the rock, again and again, until Lao Piao was nearly knocked unconscious. Xu Xian lifted a heavy stone, ready to end this devil's life for good. But at the last moment, he stopped. If Lao Piao were to die now, it would be far too merciful. So he changed his plan. While Lao Piao was unconscious, Xu Xian forcibly shoved a tracking capsule into his stomach. As long as this thing remains, he could track Old Park's location anytime. He wanted to make this killer live in fear every day. No one could have anticipated this decision would later become Xu Xian's deepest regret. After doing all this, Xu Xian stomped on Old Park's wrist, breaking it, then quietly left. Shortly after, Old Park slowly regained consciousness. Just then, he noticed something placed beside him. It was an envelope containing a thick stack of cash. Old Park was momentarily bewildered, but money is always welcome. Dragging his injured body, he walked. He tried to flag down a car by the roadside to get to the hospital. Finally, one stopped for him. Just got in when I noticed the driver's eerie gaze, turns out. He was actually a robber. Two villains collided in the car, and soon a fierce brawl erupted. Fists and elbows flew until the vehicle spun out of control, crashing into Old Park's guardrail before stopping. Staggering out, Old Park intended to fetch clothes from the trunk to hide the bloodstains, but instead found the real driver's corpse. Without flinching, he changed into clean clothes and drove away. Soon, he arrived at a small clinic. Seeing his severe injuries, the nurse bandaged him up. But as she finished, Old Park's eyes turned. Chilling again, he stared at her clearly. Dark intentions had resurfaced, just as danger loomed. Then hurried footsteps echoed outside. Xu Xian had tracked him here and burst. Entering the clinic and witnessing this scene, his rage instantly erupted as he grabbed the nearby large syringe. Old Park's head was slammed down hard, leaving him dizzy and disoriented from the blows. Barely able to stand, the nurse tried to flee but was blocked by So-hyun. For a moment, he couldn't tell who was truly dangerous, standing frozen in terror. So-hyun drew a knife and without hesitation, severed Old Park's Achilles tendon. Screams echoed through the clinic as So-hyun watched coldly. Then he knocked him unconscious again. When Old Park awoke once more, he found himself abandoned in a desolate wasteland, surrounded only by wilderness and biting wind. Gritting through excruciating pain, he struggled to his feet, drove away while drinking to numb the agony. Yet every time he tried to hide, So-hyun always pinpointed his location with eerie accuracy. After several attempts, Old Park began to suspect the car had been tampered with. So he abandoned the car by the roadside and grabbed a screwdriver, ready to hijack another one. But this time the car he stopped happened to be carrying a pair of Special Forces soldiers. Old Park could only awkwardly back away, pretending as if nothing had happened. Failing to steal a car, he had to limp away on his injured leg. Finally, he arrived at a friend's house. Just as he entered the yard, he saw a fat man feeding meat to a dog. This fat man turned out to be another serial killer, and his methods were even more brutal. The fat man burst into laughter at Old Park's disheveled appearance. To welcome his friend, he even brought Old Park to the basement. There was a bound woman imprisoned there. The fat man intended to process her as cooking ingredients. Just as he was about to take action, sudden noises came from outside the door. So-hun tracked them down once again. Seeing the intruder, the fat man immediately pounced. The two engaged in a fierce fight, overturning tables and chairs. The walls shook, but the fat man was clearly no match for So-hun. Before long, So-hun brutally snapped his wrist. So-hun then forcefully drove the screwdriver into the table, pinning the fat man's hand in place. The fat man howled in excruciating pain. So-hun stared coldly at him, not a trace of warmth in his eyes. But just then, Old Park upstairs was startled awake by the commotion. He frantically grabbed his shotgun and rushed downstairs. Bullets were fired in rapid succession. Xuxian reacted with lightning speed, rolling and dodging through the gunfire, then scaled along the exterior wall of the balcony, barehandedly, climbed up to the second floor, soon vanished into the night. Only the sweating fat man remained in the basement. Gritting his teeth, he desperately tried to pull his wrist out from under the screwdriver. Xuxian rummaged through the room, soon discovered a box of fishing hooks and a sturdy fishing rod right there. As he prepared to act, hurried footsteps suddenly came from the stairwell. The fat man charged over with a steel knife in hand, his face twisted with ferocity. The fat man was massive and looked intimidating, but against Xuxian, he stood no chance. Xuxian grabbed a fishing rod and mercilessly swung it at the fat man's head. Just then, Xuxian suddenly noticed movement at the other end of the hallway. Old Park was slowly approaching with a shotgun in hand. Xuxian reacted swiftly, continuously, scattering it all over the hallway, then silently retreated into the shadows. Old Park remained unaware of the danger, stepped on it. The sharp fish hook instantly pierced the sole of his foot. The excruciating pain made him scream out loud. As soon as the scream faded, Xuxian had already charged out. The fishing rod swung again. Old Park's head became the target of his rage once more. The wooden stick came down repeatedly until the fishing rod was broken. Yet, even so, Xuxian still didn't take his life. He didn't want this man's life to end so quickly. To Xuxian, death would be too easy. He wouldn't let Old Park die peacefully, but keep struggling in fear and agony. This game of revenge had only just begun. Soon after, Xuxian sent the injured Old Park to the hospital. On the surface, it looked like a merciful rescue, but in reality, it was just to prolong the torment. Xuxian's colleague asked if the tracking capsule was effective. Xuxian was just about to answer. Suddenly remembering something, he stopped abruptly, because Old Park was lying on the adjacent hospital bed. He glanced at the other person. Seeing Old Park still had his eyes closed, he finally let out a sigh of relief. But Xuxian never expected Old Park had actually woken up long ago and was just pretending to sleep. After Xuxian left, Old Park revealed a sinister smile. He knew the tracker had been planted on him. It was time for counterattack. Old Park rushed to the nearby pharmacy and bought a whole bottle of antidote. The man collapsed instantly. Then he inserted the tracker into the other's body. Everything was executed cleanly and efficiently. When So-hun arrived at the restroom, following the signal, he realized he'd been tricked. The knocked-out man lay on the floor, while Old Park had long since vanished. This time, the initiative completely fell into Old Park's hands. After escaping, Old Park didn't continue hiding, but made an unexpected decision instead. Called the police to turn himself in. But this wasn't out of a guilty conscience. Rather, it was a carefully calculated scheme. Old Park knew that if he kept tangling with Shuhan, he'd eventually be tortured to death. Only by seeking police protection could he save his own life. But before walking into the police station, he planned to do one more thing. That was to take revenge on Shuhan's family. Shuhan already sensed something was wrong at this point. He rushed to the hospital immediately, slapped the still-living fat man awake violently, hoping to extract Old Park's whereabouts from him. But the fat man not only refused to talk, he kept mocking Shuhan incessantly, even used Xuyan's death to provoke him. When he was at his wit's end, the police station suddenly received a call. Finally, Old Park had just contacted the police saying he was finishing one last thing